In case you miss it, here's a Sports Animal Rewind.
Let's talk college football. It's time for the Sports Page Summer of College Football, presented by Buddy Gregg RVs and Motorhomes, our daily preview of teams and conferences around the country for the upcoming college football season. Find Buddy Gregg RVs and Motorhomes on their Facebook page, their website at buddygregg.com, and follow them on Twitter at Buddy Gregg RVs. Now let's take a look at the Georgia Bulldogs.
To help us do that, we bring in from the Macon Telegraph and the Columbus Ledger-Enquirer covering the Georgia Bulldogs. Let's get Seth on the line. Seth Emerson joins us here on the new Sentinel Sports Page. Hey, Seth, Vincent, Mike, good morning. How you doing, Seth?
I'm doing excellent.
Well, great. We appreciate your time. Let's start. I don't know if you were able to hear Mark Richt. They're coming back from break from the SEC meetings in Destin talking about Aaron Murray. And I like the way he refers to him as Murray. How can Aaron Murray be better this year in his last year with Georgia?
Oh, that's a good question. He's talked in the offseason a couple times with me and with some other reporters about running the ball a little more. He actually came into college as a little bit of a dual threat kind of guy, and he ran a lot as a freshman. Obviously, Georgia runs a pro-style offense, though, and I think in the effort to kind of hone down work on the other elements of the offense, he became a little bit more of a pocket passer, and he's gonna probably try and get back to running a little bit more. He's not going to turn into Colin Kaepernick out there, but I think he's going to possibly take a few more advantages, take a few more chances there, and overall, just in terms of becoming a better quarterback, there's been room for improvement in certain games the whole time, but you really, I think if Georgia fans, if you could get the same senior season out of Aaron Murray that you had as a junior, I think they'll certainly take that.
Seth, I'm looking at this offense and just I don't know what the school record is for points averaged or yards per game, but this looks like an offense.
It was all last year. whatever they did last year, that was the record.
What do you expect it to be as potent this year? More potent? Not quite? Where is it going to be this year?
Well, they only lose one key guy, Tavares King, who was an underrated receiver, to be honest, for the last 3 years. He was kind of overshadowed by A.J. Green his first couple of years and overshadowed by Malcolm Mitchell the last couple, but Tavares King's been statistically a leading receiver. However, they're so deep at receiver. Not only Malcolm Mitchell now being full-time there, but Michael Bennett, Chris Conley, a few younger guys that can move into bigger roles that I'm not sure how much they'll miss Tavares King. They've got to figure out the line. The offensive line, frankly, it's a little bit of a miracle, and it's a testament to the ability of Georgia's skill position players like Aaron Murray, Todd Gurley, Keith Marshall, Malcolm Mitchell, those receivers, the tight ends. It's a testament to them that this offense was so good last year because the offensive line has really not been great. And you saw that against South Carolina last year with Jadeveon Clowney and other members of the Gamecock defense ran roughshod over that line. So the way they need to be better, Mike, is they need to be that way every game, and that includes the South Carolina game in particular. They did not perform well in that game, but statistically throughout the course of the entire season, they were good because they kind of made up for it in some other games, but they can be better by being that way every game.
Joined by Seth Emerson, helping us preview the Georgia Bulldogs in 2013 from the Macon Telegraph, Columbus Ledger-Enquirer. On that offensive line, are there position battles, or is it a matter of those returning starters just playing better?
The position battles are on the offensive line, not at any skill position players. They're moving players around. The only guy really assured of starting right now is at center, David Andrews, who's a little bit undersized, but he gets the job done. He's one of those fundamental guys that they just depend on. The guy with the most upside on the offensive line is John Theus, who will be a sophomore this year, and he started every game at right tackle last year. He was a 5-star recruit, just kind of one of these guys that you expected. Once he got here, he was only going to be here for 3 years because he was just that good. But he was a little inconsistent last year, and they actually, in the depth chart they released after spring practice, he was not listed as a starter, which may have just been kind of trying to send a message to him because look, he can't not start. If he's not starting, it's not a reflection on the talent, that he got beat out by someone better. It's that he didn't do a good enough job. So I'd watch that. I'd watch and see if John Theus does end up locking down a starting job. If he doesn't, the offensive line could be in trouble.
Seth, I'm going to flip over to the defense, and I was looking at a depth chart this morning in the secondary, and if I read it right, the 4 starters: sophomore, freshman, junior. Does that sound about right?
Yeah, Damian Swan Jr. He's actually been a starter pretty much the last 2 years, and they're expecting him to be pretty steady as that number 1 cornerback now. It depends on how you look at it in the secondary. Josh Harvey-Clemens is a sophomore, is listed as the starter at strong safety. He's suspended the first game because of the drug incident here, and that's an important game. It's Clemson. It's not Buffalo. But he also, I look at them as not a 3-4 right now. I think most of the time they are a 4-2-5, and that means 5 guys in the secondary, and Josh Harvey-Clemens starts at kind of a slot nickelback role, and he played so little last year that he's even said this, Josh has said this to me, that he feels like a freshman. So if you count him as kind of a first-year player, both the safeties probably will be first-year players, and the other cornerback will be a guy, Sheldon Dawson, a guy who hasn't played very much. They are young all over the place in that secondary. They are skilled. There's a lot of talent back there. It's 4- and 5-star talent, but they're first and second years in terms of getting significant playing time. So you know how that goes sometimes.
How big of an impression has true freshman Trey Matthews made with this team?
Big impression. Early enrollee. So he is not a guy that you're throwing in here in August and teaching him the defense and then hoping by the time the Clemson and South Carolina games come around, he's up to speed. He'll need to get up to SEC game speed, obviously, because he was in high school last year, but he has been around for a while. He made the same kind of impression in spring practice that Todd Gurley was making in preseason practice last year, and you see how that turned out. So that's good news for Georgia, but that doesn't guarantee that he's going to be spectacular as a freshman. It just means that they feel a lot better about their secondary because they do feel like they have a superstar in the making back there in Trey Matthews, but how quickly that comes to fruition is key.
Well, I think while we're talking about this young secondary, that's a pretty natural segue to I'm looking at the schedule over here, and I'd be hard pressed to find a team that opens with a tougher schedule at Clemson.
Right.
Then you got South Carolina, North Texas is North Texas. Then you got LSU. So there's 3 really good games out of your first 4, and then by the way you go on the road against Tennessee, which won't be an easy game. So that's you're talking about a bunch of young guys, and like you said, they're not going against Buffalo. They're going against Clemson, South Carolina, LSU in their first month.
We're gonna find out a lot about this team right away. And what's interesting is that 2 years ago they had kind of a similar start. They opened against Boise State here at the Georgia Dome.
Right.
I'm not actually at the Georgia Dome right now, but it's an hour away, so I guess I can say here. And then they played their typical SEC opener against South Carolina the second week, and they just did terrible against Boise State in the opener. Came back the next week, played well against South Carolina, but still lost. So they were 0-2. Last year, South Carolina game was middle of the year, huge game, and they played terrible. Except both years, they were able to overcome that and still end up in Atlanta playing for the SEC title, and last year playing for a spot in the national title game. So I think there's a sense around this program that the start to the season and the first 1 or 2 games, while very important, it's not the be-all, end-all. So I think they've got a little bit more of a mature mindset going in. They're not, put it this way, 2 years ago, with that Boise State opener looming, it was all anyone could talk about. Boise State, Boise State, Boise State. You're not really getting that with Clemson this time around. People are more talking about the entire season. They're talking about their position battles. You don't see much. And I think that's hopefully for Georgia a better sign, because 2 years ago it was all about Boise State, and it didn't really help them when they actually played that game.
Previewing the Georgia Bulldogs in 2013 was Seth Emerson from the Macon Telegraph and Columbus Ledger-Enquirer, based out of Athens, covering the Georgia Bulldogs. On our sports-based summer of college football, Vince Ferrara, Mike Strange. Seth, let's talk about that front seven on defense. A lot of guys headed to the NFL. Where are those position battles, and what do you like and don't like in that group?
Well, the defensive line, 3-4, and like I said, I do think of it as a 4-2-5, but the defensive line is still kind of a situation where a lot of guys are going to play, and so it's not a matter of that there's going to be a superstar on that line. You can't really project that, and they don't have that at nose tackle. Going into last year, going into 2 years ago, they had these just mammoth nose tackles, John Jenkins and Kwame Gathers. John Jenkins was drafted, Kwame Gathers was not, but he's in camp with the Chargers. And that's a lot of talent, a lot of pounds they lose. And how they replace that, it's interesting. They're doing something different this year. They're not really talking about guys being the nose, being the stopgap in the middle. They're talking about rotating guys in and out. The guy who is most likely to start at the nose is much smaller than the guys they've had in that spot before. Mike Thornton, the kid's name, is about 6'2", 295. He's not even at 300 pounds. So the line is going to be interesting to watch. I don't know if you're going to get much production out of that. They're just hoping that it'll be solid in terms of run defense. Linebackers, the key is, to me, how they do it inside linebacker. Amaro Herrera is a returning starter. He's a junior. He's going to be kind of the captain of the defense. He's not as good as Alec Ogletree, but he's got a chance to be a very solid inside linebacker. But that other inside linebacker spot, it's a question whether that's going to be a lockdown spot. Jordan Jenkins at outside linebacker should be a star in the making. He was second on the team in sacks last year after Jarvis Jones. But the concern for Georgia is, can you get somebody else to be a factor, or multiple people, in terms of running or rushing the quarterback? If you don't, then other teams are just going to load up and double block Jordan Jenkins, and you're not going to get a productive view out of him. So they need a pass rush out of somebody to take something off of Jordan Jenkins.
Seth, was there any turnover on the coaching staff this year?
Defensive line coach Rodney Garner left for Auburn, his alma mater. He was also the recruiting coordinator, but they had kind of split recruiting duties among everybody. They replaced him with Chris Wilson, who was the defensive line coach and defensive coordinator the last couple of years under Dan Mullen at Mississippi State. That is the only coaching change that they have had over the last 2 years. One assistant coach spot over the last 2 years. A lot of stability under Mark Ripp lately.
Visiting with Seth Emerson, helping us preview Georgia here on the new Sentinel Sports page. Just bounce to the offense. I mean, we hadn't specifically talked about Gurley and Marshall, but how do you anticipate them using those two this year? Will that be any different from a year ago?
Well, I think they want to. The quick answer is that you'll see probably a little bit more out of Keith Marshall, and you'll see a little bit more out of Todd Gurley in the passing game. Utilize them a little bit more. They've talked about that. Mike Bobo's talked about that. But the other thing, it's kind of like with Aaron Murray. You don't want to mess too much with it, and you don't want to try and expect too much. I think the key with the offense in general is not reading too much into their press clippings, not getting too comfortable after what they did last year, because that's what happened to the defense last year. The defense last year for Georgia was in the same position that the offense is going into 2013. They had all these NFL guys. A lot of these guys had passed up going pro, like Jarvis Jones, who could have been a first-round pick 2 years ago. And they just expected to be as good as they were in 2011, if not better. And they weren't. They struggled a lot, especially in run defense. And there were suspensions, and it was just a mess until halfway through the year when Sean Williams, the safety, just went on a public rant against his own defense. And it ignited the team, but it frankly should not have taken that. It should have happened a lot sooner than that. And so if you're a Georgia fan hoping for the best, what you're hoping is that the offense saw that last year and remembers what happened with the defense. And so they're not going to lose that hunger. They're not going to get complacent. And you never know until the season actually happens, but that's what you're hoping for on this offense is that you're just as hungry and then therefore just as productive as you were last year.
Seth, last year in Athens, Arthur Lynch had some big plays against Tennessee. Talk about that tight end position and then also fullback as well.
Arthur Lynch is a guy who's a little bit underappreciated around here. He's going to be going into his second year as a starter. He's a senior. He had a big catch down the middle to set up that final play against Alabama in the SEC championship game. And he's a guy that going into last year was known as a good blocker, but what are you going to get as a pass receiver? And by the end of the year, he was a big part of the passing offense. Behind him, they got a guy named Jay Rome, who, although he redshirted 2 years ago as a freshman because of the depth ahead of him, he was a guy who was a 4 or 5-star recruit, depending on who we're talking to, coming out of high school. So Arthur Lynch is kind of underappreciated because you'll still hear people saying, well, they need to get the ball to Jay Rome more. Jay Rome should be starting the tight end, when it's like, well, senior they've got starting now, Arthur Lynch is pretty good and is working his way into some NFL draft boards. So they're pretty good at that tight end position, and frankly, they always have since I've been here. It's just a place that kind of is very good at pinpointing tight ends and developing them. Fullback is a position at Georgia that's on the field about less than half the time at this point, especially lately when they've been going to the spread, but they've got some depth there. They've got a former walk-on, guy could still be a walk-on when the season starts. Merritt Hall is the starter, and then a guy they recruited. Not many programs out there recruit fullbacks, but Georgia still does. They're pretty good. They're pretty deep and in pretty good shape at both tight end and fullback positions.
And quickly touch on special teams because I know that was erratic at times for Georgia.
Yeah, Marshall Morgan was a freshman last year, and early in the season he was the type that would miss an extra point and then ding another one off the uprights and in, and then miss another extra point or another short field goal, and then make a couple 52-yarders. So he was a little bit all over the place as the season went on last year. He cut down on the problems with the shorter field goals, but then still wasn't consistent from 40 and longer. So they need him to kind of shake that off and become what they expected when they got him in here. And punting-wise, Colin Barber was very consistent. He was okay last year. Otherwise, their special teams last year was okay. It had been an issue the last couple of years, but just in terms of fundamentals, in terms of kickoff coverage and stuff like that, it was better last year. It was just the field goal kicking and extra point kicking was an issue.
Seth, Georgia came just so close to winning that SEC championship game this year, and as everybody looks towards what's going to happen in 2013, what's it going to take for this to be a happy season for Bulldog fans? I know you're projected to win the East, so at least that, but is it going to take an SEC championship for everybody to feel fulfilled?
Not around the team. I think there's a large segment of the fan base that will not be happy, period, ever, unless they win the SEC, and lately that means winning the national championship. I think everyone was fairly satisfied the way last year ended, considering you were so close. If they'd been beaten a little bit more soundly, if they had not had that final drive against Alabama to at least make it oh so close, I think more people would have been disappointed. But there's the prevailing sense around the fan base and around the program is that they were 5 yards away from winning a national championship last year. And they're not the only people that think that. So it's a somewhat realistic impression. And if you're in, it's not going to be the exact same scenario this year, obviously, but if they're that close again, I think, people will be satisfied. If they dip back to, if they have another bad performance against like the one they had against South Carolina last year, there will be a lot of people who will be unhappy. I mean, look, Mark Richt has not won a national championship here, and it's been a while since they've won an SEC. So despite his winning percentage, despite the consistent success, he's one loss away from people continuing to grumble. So that's just going to be the way it is. I do not think it's national championship or SEC championship or bust, but considering the last 2 years that they got to Atlanta with, the benefit of the schedule, if this year they don't get to Atlanta again, at least in the SEC East, then I think that will be a disappointment.
Seth Emerson covers the Georgia Bulldogs for the Macon Telegraph and Columbus Ledger-Enquirer. Nice enough to share some insight and knowledge on Georgia here on our Sports Page Summer of College Football. You can follow him on Twitter at Seth Emerson on Twitter. Seth, great to talk to you. Really appreciate you, and maybe we'll see you at SEC Football Media Days coming up.
All right, man. Thanks, man.
Thanks, Seth. That is Seth Emerson, covers the Georgia Bulldogs. Does a very nice job.